Aloha Maikaku, and this is our concluding session to a very, very scintillating and very, very participative, robustly participative symposium, despite the odds of the weather, Governor Josh hovering over there, threatening to close the university. Will he, won't he? But I'm glad we've managed to reach this point. And I'm a little sad that our visitors who came from so far away could not present in person, but I think it's going really well. So in this curated conversation, we bring together two scholars of South Asia and two indigenous Hawaiian scholars to talk about the idea of the commons in their separate contexts. And we've seen, especially through the morning session, how with the kind of specter of caste, the Indian past or any possibility of the commons seems absolutely impossible, or in Prem Singh's words, foreclosed. Whereas like it seems like a very perversion of the term commons. Whereas with the whole tradition of the Aloha Aina, that does not seem to be the case. So it's kind of counterintuitive to bring these two worlds together, one that suggests a very kind of deep sense of violence, and the other, which is not without its violence, but at the same time has this more living tradition of reciprocity and aloha. And so to the extent that commons are capable of communing, or commoning rather, of creating shared space, we will see if something critical can emerge through this juxtaposition. I was really struck yesterday by one of the presenters, Kawēlau's presentation. He talked about how the Hawaiian word for the surf crashing into the beach or into the sand is not crashing, it's rubbing, which is, and he also said that it conjures a more sultry image. So I'm hoping there's something sexy going to emerge from this, that it'll be not a crashing of these two violently different kinds of contexts, scholarly contexts, but something which is more gentle, more rubbing, more sexy, whatever. And we'll see. So, yeah, I wanted to just mention a few remarks to start the conversation going. As the trajectory of the wonderful presentations and conversations over the course of the last 2 days have shown us, the idea of commons is something that becomes available to us only from the ground of something contrary to it, and uncommons and anti-commons and non-commons. A commons would be impossible to articulate from a space which is already commons. It would be redundant, to say the least. Insofar as the commons have been posited against modern-day capitalist enclosures, history of colonialism or caste oppression, it continues to be seen as a question of return, whether return to something harmonious, something better, whether it be an agrarian past or a post-capitalist or modern past. This simple binary between destructive colonial imaginaries and a more nourishing indigenous imagination of the commons has a tendency to obfuscate the different mediations of the concept, the alienations and cycles of violence that accompany the commons itself, something that Viren touched upon. If we are being serious, then we cannot afford to trade in such simplistic binaries. So the two questions that I think that this conversation will attend to are, firstly, what in Hawaiian or South Asian history affords the persistence of the gift relation or the relations of reciprocity and sharing implicit in the idea of the commons? And the second question, what are the customary forms of social regulation that accompany the idea of a previously existing commons or a fantasy of such a commons, such as kingship rules and practices that obstruct the translation of such past imaginaries into something more universal, something capable of challenging capital's subsumptive drive which is particularly parasitical on vitalist formations such as community and the communal. Our speakers today are Kawēlau Kealoha Wright, Kaipulaumakaniolono, Keala, Mekhola Gomes, and Viren Murthy. Kawēlau is an assistant professor of Kamakakūokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies in the Hawaii Nuiakia School of Hawaiian Knowledge, University of Hawaii at Mānoa. She's also the endowed chair for the Gladys Brandt Endowment for Comparative Polynesian Studies. Kawēlau earned a BA and MA in Hawaiian Studies and an MA and PhD in the Geography and Environmental Department at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. Areas of Kawēlau's research include land tenure, land laws, indigenous studies, and archival research. Kaipu Keala is a mo'olanu lona on Kanaloa for the Protect Kahawalave Ohana, as well as an assistant professor at the Kamakakūokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies. Mekhola Gomes is assistant professor of history and Asian languages and civilizations at Amherst College. Gomes is a social historian of medieval South and Southeast Asia. Her current book manuscript, Sexual Properties, Kinship, and the Transition to Early Medieval India is a history of the organizations of sex and gender and their relationship to property in early medieval South Asia. She's also working on a project that explores economic and social interactions across the Eastern Indian Ocean world, particularly between Indonesia and India. Viren Murthy is a professor of transnational Asian history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and researches Chinese, Japanese, and Indian intellectual history. Since Viren's speech keynote talk was just prior to this, I'm going to skip the long introduction, Viren, if you will excuse me.
I was also thinking, should I go first or should we change the order a little bit?
I think our OEV scholars should go first, yeah, because just to give a break. So I think without further ado, I'm going to open the stage for Kaipu and Kawēlau because their presentation is an integrated one to start the discussion. To be followed by Mekhola, and Viren, you will finish. Yeah. Everybody has 15 minutes.
Okay, mahalo. Just trying to get my slides in order. How am I going to present and see my notes? Didn't think about this. Okay, let me pull up my Google Doc on my phone. Sorry. But mahalo nui for joining us today. And what Kawēlau and myself are going to propose or begin is kind of like an exploratory investigation of the commons in Hawaii. There is no scholarship on this topic, and so we're trying to furnish a foundation for more critical inquiry in the context of the conversation today, but especially to develop Hawaiian studies as a discipline moving forward. And so mahalo everybody for enduring the learning curves, I guess, of this presentation. Okay, so let's jump right in. So I'm going to try and structure what I think the commons can be, how the commons can be conceived in antiquity. And then Kawēlau is going to cover how they were codified in Hawaiian Kingdom law, which is kind of like 1809 or so through to 1893, and how those commons were then enclosed in 1895. And then we'll talk about the Hawaiian Renaissance a little bit. But basically, I have these 4 guideposts here for thinking through what the commons can be. And there's these 4 kind of expressions that we have, talking about aina as an ali'i, and ali'i, and then what the relationship between Hawaiian commoners and ali'i should be. And so the aina is is basically not always going to be aina. Okay, land is not always land. Land is land only insofar as it feeds people. Okay, this definition by David Marlowe that I have quoted on the top here is that aina is actually a moku, and it's only so when you're talking about aina, it's constituted through this relationship with humans in which it develops productive capacities. And in that cultivation by the human, the aina becomes an ali'i. And this is a proverb that Kamana shared. It was also brought up yesterday. But he ali'i ka aina he kawa ke kanaka. Okay, land is king or queen, chief, and humans are the slaves, are the servants of the land. So then you have to think, okay, if this is our relationship to land base that we hold in common, what is it that makes an ali'i an ali'i? And we have this other proverb that says, "Ili'i ke li'i ke kanaka." An ali'i is a commoner until people rally around them, until people elevate the dignity of the ali'i. And so there's a great story that illustrates this dynamic. This is the story of Paka'a and Kuapaka'a, in which their king, Keawenui Umi, is kind of like the Lacanian definition of a fool. He really believes himself to be the king, in the absence of the social relation. And it takes, all these trials of tribulations of losing his two most prized servants to him for him to realize that he's nothing but a figurehead and that the actual ali'i function is the kanaka who functions on behalf of the ali'i. And so ali'i then are the common kanaka is generative of both aina and ali'i. And so the way I'm thinking about this is they're kind of sublimated in the Lacanian terms. And I'm using this from Lacan Seminar 7. Okay, they're elevated to the dignity of the thing, okay, by the Kanaka. That thing which is beyond the signified, it's the sacred, the divine, the truth. And by raising the dignity of these, if we treat the Aina and the Ali'i as an object, they take on a sort of coherence of being, okay, by virtue of being in proximity to das Ding, that primordial lost object drenched in the mystique of divinity. And so Aina and Ali'i are both religious kind of categories, and therefore these economic and kinship categories, concepts that exist only insofar as they feed, provide, and protect for the Kanaka. Okay, so that's kind of the general framework. Next slide. Okay, so this one I gotta read. Okay. So by virtue of being in proximity to the beyond of the signified, the ali'i, the aina, but especially the ali'i, I think, assume this aura of dignity that's associated with the beyond of the signified. Okay, so when the beyond of the signified is named, it's most often called the pole. Okay, this sort of primordial oblivion. It's ever enmeshed in its own chaotic regeneration and destruction, from whence life emerges. It's called the Great Provisioning Night. That's this expression on the top, kapo nui ho'olakolako. And so this is kind of the underlying basis for all Hawaiian politics traditionally. Okay, those who could identify with the pole beyond signification by virtue of tracing their genealogy to it, okay, the ali'i, were vested with the authority to kalai aina, literally carve out the land, our term for politics. Okay, this is what Kamana was saying, about how the reset of wealth, it doesn't accrue over generations. Okay, they have this right because in order to identify with the pole, they must assume the kapu, okay, the prohibitions, the taboos, opposite the pole. These prohibitions that instate their identity with divinity while also constraining them to execute the will of the pole. Okay, I don't have the space to kind of fully develop it here, but suffice it to say that this will of the pole is to grow and to destroy and to grow even more as it destroys itself. Okay? And the Oiwi mind considers this kind of the natural state of being for land, as in people, as something that will cancerously grow to the point of consuming itself, bursting asunder until it remolds itself in the fires of its own creation. Interfering in this process is the job of the ali'i. And this occurs by establishing a reciprocal relationship with the environment. And I rely on Kojin Karatani here, okay, who's thinking in terms of modes of exchange as opposed to modes of production. And he talks about how sacrifices, he explains magic. He uses magic to explain reciprocity rather than using reciprocity to explain magic, which is what Maus does. He says that sacrifices are gifts that impose a debt on nature, thereby sealing off the anima of nature and transforming it into an it. The same is true for magic. It is a mistake to think that magic consists of manipulating the natural world by means of spells or ritual. Magic made it possible to objectify nature as an it by despiritualizing it by means of the gift. Okay? And George Kanahele says virtually the same thing in the context of ceremony. Okay, he says the underlying value at work in ceremony is reciprocity. In fact, nothing so seems to have so much to be so characteristic of the Hawaiian relationship between the temporal and spiritual world as the notion of reciprocal obligations. Yeah, so to kind of illustrate this with a simple example, okay, like Kane is our god of life, but one of his well-known body forms is water. And so you you give the gods back their own body forms in order, and that kind of satiates them. And so in this procedure, we take Kane water from Kane the god, and then Kane water is then rebranded in some sense as a human product by way of ceremonial preparation. Okay, you conduct an incantation over the water, store it in a special vessel, and then it's sacrificed back to Kane. So by passing the sacrifices through the locus of the human, wherein it acquires the mana with which we ho'omana, we empower, we worship the gods, this ho'okupu that is now the god alienated from himself is able to meet the mana emanating from the akua. Like two electrical charges of the same magnitude but opposite signs. The kapu of Kanaka, yeah, the religious principles and laws of sanctity that are instilled by the Kanaka, meet the kapu emanating from the akua. And they cancel each other out and secure a neutralized field for Kanaka in which humans have the right, the kuleana, the privilege, to tap into the source that is the Akua as they reveal themselves through the Aina. Yeah. Kanaka must constantly make offerings to keep up with the mana emanating from nature to sustain our state of reciprocal neutrality with the Akua. Okay. Now, obviously, it's not sustainable to think that every single person is going to do this for every single god and then, confront the whole reality of nature. And so there becomes this objective function of the chiefs who have this identity with creation, to fulfill this function. Okay? The elite performs the objective sealing off of the anima of nature, for their constituents. Okay? Through the various ceremonies held by the chiefs, they reinstate their people's separation from and neutrality with nature by way of presenting sacrifices on the people's behalf. Okay? The fact that the gift is a defense that keeps nature at bay may not necessarily register in the minds of the plebeian masses, but it matters not what they know, but rather what they do, okay? I.e. Zizek, okay? We're fetishists in practice, not the kind. And I'd like to bring in Tupinamba here, okay? So this separation, sealing off of the anima in nature is kind of like a way in which it becomes nobody's territory. Okay, so in Tupinama's discussion of the enclosure of the commons, he says, since the commons are not produced under the rules of private ownership, which would guarantee their later exchangeability, they must first be segregated, their use by others impeded, so that a lake, someone's time, or an idea can be considered property, and therefore something which can be alienated, passed on, and possessed by someone else in the market. Okay, the absence of a market and a general disdain for peddlers common to gift economies is replaced, according to the logic of Kapu, by a combination of an ontological alienation from the pole. Okay, we have this saying that repeats itself throughout the Kumulipo that says humans are barred from creation, and a disavowal of possessions. The land belongs to no one. Kapu, sacredness, is fundamentally a prohibition as law that separates the sacred from the profane, okay, sacred chiefs from the profane commoners, land that emerges from the divine powers of creation from all of humanity. So, though the Aina may be considered property of the Ali'i, in that they, via what Kamana described as Kalai Aina, every successive Ali'i needing to carve the land again, resetting wealth, yeah, as a means by which the Ali'i asserts a certain possession, control, exclusion, and disposal of the land, they do so only in an effort to relieve themselves of their possession. Okay, and this is the second George Kanahele quote. As he argues, wealth is found not so much in your possessions, but in the ability to give generously of what you possess. Kanaka found the ultimate gratification from wealth in the prestige, pride, and power, the mana they gained through acts of social and spiritual distinction. Okay, so basically, kapu, I think, concomitantly as a mark of the thing and a framework engendering reciprocity constitutes the commons. Access to water, wood, the ability to slash right to domesticate animals, farm plants and fish as belonging principally to no one. We are constitutionally estranged from creation, barred from creation. And so it belongs to no one. Therefore, it belongs to everyone. And this right to live, right to subsist, is all codified in the Mahele under the subject to the right of native tenants that Kawēlau knows a lot more about than I. So I will let her take over from there. You stay mute. You stay mute.
Okay, there we go. Mahalo,
Yeah.
Kaipu. Okay, so we're going to talk about the 1848 Mahele. Now, I'm going to try and keep this simple. In Hawaiian Studies, we actually do have a class that you can take for 16 weeks learning about the Mahele. But just for today's example, I just wanted to sort of touch on the codification that happens during the Hawaiian Kingdom period in order for us to understand what happens afterward with these, was it enclosing of these commons. So in 1848, there was a hybrid land tenure system that was put into place. And basically what it did, so in this first image on the left-hand side, you see there's like a cylinder or like a cylinder that has different layers. And this is how I would say that we should think about it, not like a pie, but like a layered cake. Okay, so it all of Hawaii's land titles originate at the Mahele. Every single one for every single parcel here in Hawaii originates here. And at this time, every single parcel, there were three different groups that held rights in every single parcel of land. There was the mo'i, or the government, and the ali'i, and the maka'ainana. So thinking about it as a layered cake gives you the understanding that it's not like a pie where one third, but it's more like in every single parcel, all of these are there. Now, during the process of the mahele itself, the mo'i government layer, as well as the ali'i layer, during the mahele process, those two rights were actually divided out via commutations. However, and this is not widely understood a lot, even here in Hawaii, but that layer for the maka'ainana or the commoner, that layer of undivided land rights is still there. It's still there in perpetuity. And this is reflected in, I have an example on the right-hand side of a palapala sila nui, which is a royal patent. These are how we went ahead and registered or codified every single land transaction that happened in Hawaii. And you can see here, it describes the actual parcel, but at the bottom there, it says either koe ke kuleana o nakanaka or koe na e ke kuleana o nakanaka, basically meaning the same thing, reserving the rights of native tenants. So no matter who's owning this parcel, right? It is like fee simple, except it isn't, because you still have these undivided rights of Native Hawaiians. These rights are still held again today in perpetuity. And it's been difficult trying to sort of, it's hard for me to teach students exactly what does that mean, right? Because I don't think that our judicial system fully understands what these rights look like and what they mean. But we have many court cases to point to showing that yes, they are still there. They are still there. So what that means for us is things like gathering rights. It can mean a lot of different things. But ultimately, I think that it's really important that we understand, that we all understand exactly where these things originate from. Next slide. All right, so in 1893, we have the illegal overthrow. Again, U.S. is implicit in that. I'm not going to talk about that really, but I just wanted to sort of set the timeline, right? So 2 years after the illegal overthrow, when I say they, I'm talking about the insurgents, right? So Sanford Dole, the people who exact the coup, they passed legislation called the 1895 Land Act. And it's this set of sweeping land laws that's really designed to do a lot of different things. However, I believe that one of that these land laws try to do is to deal with these codified Hawaiian Kingdom land laws that prioritize Native Hawaiians. Um, they do that in a number of different ways. One of the biggest ways that they do this, though, in the 1895 Land Act is they combine the land banks that are the government land banks and the Crown Land Bank. Um, Now, it's important to understand that the Crown lands historically are were the personal property of the reigning mo'i, the reigning king or queen. And this was because they didn't take a salary. These were the lands, and leasing these lands, obtaining income from these lands is how they sustained themselves. This was their personal property. However, in this Land Act, the first thing that they do is they take those crown lands, put them together with the government lands, and then they rename them public lands. Now, the choice of using the word public lands is not an accident, right? You can check out the US's long love affair with labeling things public lands. In Hawaii, I would say that there's not very much about them that are public at all. And actually, these lands end up being used by the usurpers, by the territorial government eventually, as a sort of land frontier to that they utilize for everything from bringing white people over from America to settle here to providing cheap land uh, in a speculative manner for some of uh, the government's supporters and employees. Um, and again, I just really want to point out the fact that the those crown lands, right? Those crown lands were an outright theft. That combining of that ho'ohuiing, that was a definite outright theft, and it was 900,000. I mean, 900. Yes, 900,000 acres of Hawaii's most valuable lands. Um, and so basically, it is this land bank and this act right here that ends up impacting what happens in the future when we take a look as we go forward toward the Constitutional Convention that happens in the 1970s.
Sorry. Okay, so jumping to 1976, okay, we have this island was bombed called Kaho'olawe. At the dawn of World War II, it was seized by the US Navy. Okay. Um, people were disturbed, but they didn't really organize anything about it until 1976 when there was a bill in Congress saying that Hawaiians should get reparations. And so they wanted to create, quote unquote, our wounded knee. And so they wanted to occupy federal lands to draw attention to the federal government. So they land on Kaho'olawe, which is on possession by the Navy. And then something about landing on Kaho'olawe confronts them with this sort of magical, mystical something emanating from nature, and the land is basically screaming out for help. Is the story that everybody who is on those who were part of the Kaho'olawe Nine tells, is that the lion was desperately pleading for love, and to somebody to care for it, and so the idea, and so they were looking for a way to kind of articulate this method, the people who came out. And then Emmett Aluli and George Helm found what's known as the Protecolawe Ohana. And they find in Aluli's grandmother's journal this expression called Aloha Aina. And Aloha Aina was something that was active in the kingdom, particularly after the overthrow, but it kind of died out from memory. And so they had their original interpretation of it, not as love of country, but instead as love of the land. And so, in order to access the land, they consulted elders in their communities, whatever. And what they were told is that they need to essentially retrieve the dignity of divinity. They need to approach the island via ceremony. They need to pray to the spirits of the island, and that the spirits are going to then help them facilitate the return of Kaho'olawe. And so this methodology of sanctify, sustain, and solidify by treating the island as something sacred, as an ali'i, it mobilized people and created a community that backed that movement. And so we see essentially the same function of sublimation happening, where Aina is then elevated to this higher level of dignity, and the people who elevate it become kind of coagulated together as people who are invested in the elevation of this thing. And so Aloha Aina becomes a sort of spark for what is known today as the Hawaiian Renaissance, which is what secures our major protections in the Constitutional Convention. Kawēlau?
Okay, so yes, this brings us to the 1978 ConCon. Now, these, well, I'm just going to go over them first, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. In the Constitutional Convention, there were a number of protections that were actually secured. One was that there was a water code that was established. Water becomes part of a public trust, and like it was in the kingdom time, actually. And then two, secured customary rights, which is a castrated version, really, of subject to the rights of native tenants. Customary rights were actually passed in this convention, in this constitutional convention. Now, what does this mean exactly, right? Number one, there's no teeth. There's no way that you're going to actually, this, and this is the reason for, even though we have this water code that was passed in 1978, which is based on kingdom law from well before that, that we're still having problems with water hoarding companies, which used to be plantations, right? Because again, there's no teeth, and so these public lands remain completely private, right? And so let's just say I as a Native Hawaiian have these customary rights. Oftentimes what that means in terms of today's thinking is, if I want to go and I want to, I don't know, pick tea leaf or something like that, I want to go gather something from the forest, that I have a process to go through, which I should be able to obtain or assert these customary rights. However, that definitely doesn't mean that Hawaiians have rights to land for housing or things like that, right? It really is. It's hard to be Hawaiian and to actually think of these things as anything more than lip service, if you will. So these public lands remain very private. I can still get arrested if I go onto these public lands. There's really not much that's public about it, although they are still labeled that way, right? Again, 168 million gallons of water are diverted from just the West Maui Mountains every single day. By these subsidiaries of the companies who executed the overthrow, right? We're talking about the A&Bs, the Wailuku Sugar. These are all people who not only helped to exact the overthrow, but they also, their descendants end up being government leaders in that time, in that transitional time. And the Constitutional Convention actually names two beneficiaries of this trust. One is the people of Hawaii in general, and number two, there's a special beneficiary status afforded to Native Hawaiians. We don't really know what that means yet, and so it's really, really, yeah. I don't know, Kaipu, can you say more about that?
Yeah, so basically what ends up happening in the Constitutional Convention is you have these things, there's this formal promise of things being held back in a public trust, or part of a sort of commons, but that formality is really a perverted kind of title that just obscures the fact that they are going to continue to be held in private hands. And so, like Kamana was saying, like, I don't know if you guys noticed in Kamana's bio, like it said something like part of his victories as a water commissioner was restoring water to streams. The fact that the water commission has to restore waters to stream is kind of the problem, is that companies are not abiding by the laws. Okay, technically, nobody has a right to the water, but these companies that divert water, and we're using water a lot because it's just easier to explain it, is the way that they rationalize their hogging of the water is they say they own the diverting mechanisms. And so then effectively they own all the water, because they're finding a way to that diversion is their private property, but the water is not. And the fact that the water is falling through is just, it's a matter of coincidence almost, kind of, it's not really their problem and blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So we have this return of a false kind of commons, which brings us to these questions. These are kind of 4 questions that we feel like might be worth kind of exploring in the discussion later. What does the return of public trust in Hawaii tell us about the very notion of the commons as it tries to assert itself today? Is it even possible? Is it feasible to even consider the emergence of a commons? This is question number 4. Is the very notion of the commons anathema to capital, and will there need to be an overcoming of one for the other to emerge? I think is something that maybe is worth consideration. Okay. And then what will it take to realize a genuine return of the Kanaka Commons? Because one of the guys who did a lot of the research on the Mahele, Donovan Preza, he says, subject to the right of native tenants used to mean everybody has a right to a house. Now it means you can pick tea leaf, you can pick ferns, so long as you don't actually mess with people's money, basically. And then there's a question of, who belongs to the commons, who do the commons belong to? Because if people can own the apparatuses for stealing from the commons that are going to, by nature of reproduction, continue to siphon the water or continue to hold the public lands actually private, then there are effectively no commons. But even though the public law says so, and this is the problem even with all of the lands that the military holds, like according to the 1959 Admissions Act, all of the lands that they're not using belong to the people of Hawaii, but they still somehow hold on to the lands as leverage for negotiation with the state, which is, completely illegal. The land already belongs to the people of Hawaii. Okay, so there's all these contradictions that come up when the commons do try to be codified in modern state law, I guess is the point. And we are probably at our time, okay, I think. So we will pass it on and save time for discussion maybe. Unless Kawēlau, you get one more thing to say.
Not at all. Mahalo.
Mahalo, both of you. Mekhola?
Thank you. I feel like that presentation really set the ground for what I'm going to be discussing. So I'll just start by sharing my screen. That's working, I hope. Right? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you to Nandini, to Mari, to Tess, and for everybody that I've met over the past 3 days. This has been an extremely enriching experience. I can't remember the last time I attended a symposium and learned so much. So thank you, all of you, for sharing your sharing your knowledge and your insights. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a chapter, arguments from one of the chapters of my book. So any and all comments, criticisms, suggestions are, more than welcome. And like Nandini mentioned, I'm a historian of medieval South and Southeast Asia. And as a social historian, I really try and apprehend social reality. So today, I'm trying to figure out if one can sort of use or think about social reality through the concept of the commons. So, beyond the question of land, the way that I'm thinking about commons is about social relationships that rested on mutuality, on negotiation and sharing to reproduce life. So commoning in order to produce food, clothing, shelter, the things that we need for subsistence, producing these things by working together. So that's how I'm sort of thinking about the idea of commons. And I'm placing this idea of commons in relation to the idea of settlement. And more specifically, so rather than commons in relation to enclosure, which is usually how we think about it, I'm thinking about commons in relation to the question of settlement. And more specifically, the Brahmadeya settlement in early medieval South Asia. Which was a pivotal time for the emergence of hierarchies based in control over common resources. These hierarchies organized medieval South Asian societies and reach into the present in new and pernicious ways. The other category that I'm thinking through is the idea of property. So unlike modern property, where we think of the individual as a proprietor who has an objective relationship to things that they own or possess, I argue that property in early medieval South Asia was a social relationship that has a double form. And here I'm indebted to Marx's insights from the Grundrisse. So the idea that proprietorship was mediated by membership in a community. Subjectively, men, and I'm using the term very specifically here, saw themselves as proprietors through membership in a community or in a clan. So Brahmin men held Brahmadeya land tenure as members of the Brahmin social class, the Brahmin Varna. To put it differently, having Brahmadeya rights in land meant being a Brahmin. Similarly, aristocrats held sexual property, and I'll return to this idea in a little bit. So aristocrats held sexual property in their female kin as heads of ruling lineages. So being a king meant having control over the sexual autonomy of women within the royal lineage. It was as members of a community that proprietors objectively related to the conditions of their social reproduction. So that included women, that included land, soil, and its produce as theirs. Relationships of property were proclaimed and guaranteed as law and managed by institutions. Medieval property law is outlined within treatises, most prominently within the legal Dharmashastra tradition that emerges at this time, specifically the root texts, the Mula texts, that are composed between 200 and 800 CE. Property law is also outlined within documents, particularly land grant charters. So sort of returning to that question of differentiating between texts. I interpret legal treatises and documents both as expressions of property to explore how theories of property were related to practice. So getting beyond this idea, the binary of theory and practice. So this map, just to orient us to the geography that we are talking about. So the 3 centuries between 300 and 600 in South Asia was a time of rapid transformations in the Deccan. So I'm talking about the Deccan region of the Indian subcontinent, which is the southern part of the Indian subcontinent. And the political economy that frames my discussion is of small local states that emerged after the dissolution of Satvahana authority, that's the name of a lineage, sometime in the 220s. This was accompanied by changes in political culture and settlement patterns. The decline of older cities, the emergence of new rural settlements, royal ritual centers that focused on Brahmanical shrines, and a reorientation in commerce. The new aristocratic class that emerged in this period forged relationships with Brahmin communities and Buddhist and Jain shrines and communities through allocations of revenue rights in villages and agricultural fields, ensuring that their prestige was recognized by other elites. So a brief discussion of older notions of property puts into relief my argument about the newness of Brahmadeya property. So in the previous early historic period, that is roughly between 0 to 300 CE in the Deccan region of the subcontinent, there was an intensification in agrarian and artisanal commodity production and the emergence of specialized occupations. Commodity production was accompanied by expansion in commerce, both local and across the Indian Ocean world, stretching from Indonesia to the Mediterranean. Exchange occurred within monetized economies based in cities that were also often political centers. Further, early historic cities were closely associated with and located close to their suburban Buddhist monastic settlements. Inscriptions that record donations to Buddhist institutions are important sources to understand early historic property. And such inscriptions would be engraved on, sculpted slabs such as this. So in fact, you can see barely an inscription on the top of this slab. So the term permanent endowment, akshaya-nivi, depending on the language, is perhaps the most significant form of early historic property. The term permanent endowment refers to a monetary fund or a principal sum of money that wealthy donors granted to Buddhist monastic communities. The principal was invested with one or more corporate groups of merchants who invested the fund in commercial ventures on behalf of the monastic community. Money was allocated to the monastic community at fixed rates of interest that earned on the principal to provide for various monastic needs, including building repair, provisioning of food and clothing, as well as expenses for rituals. At the start of the 2nd century CE, the expression permanent endowment, akshaya-nivi, also came to denote land tenure, where rather than a monetary fund, wealthy individuals gave rights in villages and agricultural fields to Buddhist monastics. This change in meaning from property in money to property in land is not teleological, and inscriptions attest to both meanings coexisting until the 9th century. So by the 4th century, new notions of property in land, undergirded by hierarchies of caste and gender, began to emerge in the Deccan. In this age of transition, military success was more important to the acquisition of authority than the established prestige of ancestry. The earliest attested Brahmadeya grants were associated with successor kings of the Satvahans who granted income from villages to Brahmin men and recorded them as copperplate grants. And this is a copperplate grant of the early Kadamba rulers. And in fact, Ananya mentioned the Kadambas yesterday, so I thought I might show you the other Kadambas, the older Kadambas, not the 11th century Kadambas. So the term Brahmadeya also appears in legal theory as a gift of tax-exempt land that kings should grant to Brahmins. So the Arthashastra, a very well-known treatise on political theory, mentions Brahmadeyas in a section on settling rural areas. It provides this argument for the state as a mechanism of settlement, nivesha, and recommends that kings provide a range of officials and state functionaries with incentives to settle in rural areas. Brahmins are at the head of this list of settlers. Kings are instructed to expel existing residents, or in the case of an uninhabited region, relocate peasants from other areas with excessive population. The ideal Brahmin settlers were officiating priests, they were teachers, chaplains, and Vedic scholars. The Arthashastra further recommends that Brahmadeya property could be inherited by heirs of equal competence, and by that they essentially mean male heirs who were also Brahmins. Thus, Brahmadeya property could only be reproduced according to hierarchies of class and gender. So these Brahmadeya settlements, for which we have increasing documentary evidence, impacted the organization of early medieval landscape. And I'm happy to return to the question of scale, for which, of course, I shall reveal that we have no data. It also impacted peasant societies within Brahmadeya villages, where peasants created new forms of commoning to negotiate and resist Brahmanical authority over surplus, over common resources, including pastures and wastelands, as well as over labor. Negotiation over rights within Brahmadeya villages led to new social organizations and hierarchies based in geographical territory rather than ties of kinship that may have transcended locality. So such processes are hinted at in an inscription from the late 3rd or early 4th century CE. It records King Jayavarman's grant of Pantura village according to the Brahmadeya tenure to 8 Brahmins. All 8 Brahmin men were made collective but unequal proprietors of surplus from the village. And here the insight that Kawēlau just offered of thinking about rights in land as layered rather than as a pie is actually extremely appropriate. So rights to surplus were divided into 24 shares with individual shares allocated to each Brahmin proprietor. As the head of the group, the Brahmin Sharvagupta Arya, here called Savagutaja, because this is a kind of inscriptional Prakrit, of the Gautama Gotra received 8 shares. 2 Brahmins received 3 shares, 2 got 1.5 shares, and so on and so forth. The distribution of unequal shares would have required that the Brahmins negotiate amongst themselves as well as with the peasants within the village with regard to surplus appropriation. As the holder of the largest share, Sharvagupta Arya assumed the role of the head of the collective. So he's the Mahajana. And the collective itself is also called the Mahajana. Yet other members may have also pooled then, and this is sort of, taking up the provocation of Nandini of sort of engaging in a certain level of conjecture. So other members may have also pooled their shares together to organize themselves in opposition to Sharvagupta Arya's authority. From the perspective of the tax-paying peasants and agro-pastoralists, however, within the village, the Brahmin collective may have appeared as an undivided tax-collecting body that held tenorial authority in Pantura village, irrespective of what divisions may have been within the collective. By granting exemptions and privileges, King Jayavarman asserted his right over the conquered region, and there is some evidence to suggest that he made this grant soon after conquest. The Brahmin recipients, in turn, conferred fortune, wealth, power, and victory to the king through the performance of rituals and the reading of divine signs considered necessary for military victory. The state relinquished its jurisdiction over the village and its claims to surplus. And this is suggested by the immunities, the pariharas that are listed, that include exemptions from the entry of the royal army and district officials into the village. The village was also exempted from fines for salt mining, exempted from fines and the royal monopoly on salt mining. The reproduction of Brahmadeya property, according to hierarchies of class and gender, rested on patriarchal control over women's sexual autonomy. The argument about marriage as a proprietary relationship within the Brahmin authored Dharmashastra legal tradition clarifies how such patriarchal control was theorized and justified. So the paradigmatic Dharmashastra text, the Manusmriti, which is probably the Dharmashastra that most people may be familiar with, discusses this within a larger section in chapter 9 on the grounds for litigation between husbands and wives. The text supports its argument for why sons always belong to the father through the analogy of the seed and field, where the wife represents the kshetra, the field that produces something. While the husband is the seed, and all offspring are the product of the seed and field. Yet sons always belong to the father. So the reasoning for this lies in the analysis of marriage as a relationship of property, where the husband is the owner of the field. He's the kshetrin, and the field is his wife, right? The kshetra. The analogy of seed and field highlights a central concern of the Dharmashastra legal tradition, control over wives through marriage and the ordering of inheritance according to the hierarchy of class and gender. Such theories of marriage as a patriarchal proprietary relationship undergirded the reproduction of Brahmanical Brahmadeya property. Finally, the entanglement between property in land and property in women's sexuality clarifies the process of transition to early medieval South Asian society. In the 3 centuries between 300 and 600 CE, the growing importance of land for politics was expressed by the idea of kingship as a marriage between the king and his domain, who was often personified as female earth. And, Jesse is here, so we can talk more about this. Control over agrarian resources was central to the debate over historical transitions in early medieval India. In 1965, historian R.S. Sharma argued that as part of the origins and first phase of feudalism between 300 and 750 CE, kings and religious elites and institutions gained control over land. Many others followed Sharma to outline the development of feudal social relationships through land grants to Brahmins and the incorporation of forest and pastoral communities as subordinate peasants tied to the land. In the last 3 decades, however, many of these same processes that were earlier understood as feudalism have now been interpreted as characterizing this new early medieval period in South Asia.
Mekhola, you have 2 minutes to wrap
Yeah,
up.
just the final paragraph. So the debate over the transition to the early medieval period in South Asian history has clarified the dynamism of the centuries between 300 to 600 CE. Yet, scholars have analyzed relationships of production as separate from social reproduction. In other words, caste has been divorced from gender within interpretations of transition. By analyzing changes in early medieval society through notions of commoning and of property as social relationships, I argue that the transition to early medieval societies was as much related to control over land as it was to the control over women's sexuality through marriage as a relationship of sexual property. That's it.
Thank you, Mekhola. Viren, you can go now.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to also share my screen, and I should probably also start with some qualifications or that I'm going to be doing something different from the other panelists. Well, let me see if here, screen, okay. I'm actually going to be talking about something, so sort of I'm obviously not a scholar of Hawaiian sovereignty or anything like that, but I thought it might be appropriate for me to talk about some reflections on Trask's thinking. Because I was actually a student here in 1990 when there was a very kind of interesting debate around the philosophy department. And so I'm going to make some comments around that debate, and then maybe so it may not be as academic as the other talks, but I will try to bring in some theoretical points that I think come out of this. So first, I want to think about the philosophy department Trask controversy after 3 decades, and then talk about how I think she identifies or engages or I guess identifies a double romanticism, and I think that's appropriate given that I've just talked about romantic anti-capitalism. So first, what I, because one of the reasons I did this is, when I come back to Hawaii, I always feel like I'm a student again. In some sense, I've never stopped being a student. And even though the debate happened around, 90 when I just came here, I didn't really pay attention to it at the time, and I didn't read Trask or anything like that. But what was interesting when I looked into it is I realized she actually graduated from the University of Wisconsin, both her BA and PhD, which makes it even more sort of relevant for me, I guess, to at least say something. So the debate and I guess the conflict was over this grad student named Joey Carter, who very put simply, I tried to get some of the information about this. I couldn't find the original article, but I actually knew the person a little bit. And he was someone who went and supposedly went to he didn't like being called haole, and I think he wrote an article and then Trask retorted saying that, well, this is a place that has been occupied by you all, and if you don't like it, you can go home, and that, which would have been a very small, turned into a huge kind of thing. And so Carter was trying to say there's a reverse racism. If you use the term haole, that's anti-white racism. Now, some of us may have heard that before. Now, in an LA Times article, we find Trask making the following comment. So with the overthrow of things, Hawaiians were outlawed and things haole American were imposed. An American in Hawaii is an American in Hawaii. Mr. Carter is benefiting from stolen goods. So this was sort of the center of the kind of controversy here. So that and I think what was interesting for me was, of course, the philosophy department became enmeshed in this. But it's especially interesting to think about this now because in 2021, the then chair of the philosophy department issued a kind of an apology, right? Which actually almost think we can think about it almost as institutional memory and an institutional self-correction, right? Almost like institutional Bildung, if you will. And one of the line that springs out to me, especially in light of this symposium, is we should have listened to her when she tried to teach us that the injustices had their roots in history and power dynamics of colonial oppression, both within the university and outside of it. So this is now the sort of almost 20-something years later. But how do we think about it in the department at the time? Well, I think that one of the things that I didn't really realize at that time, but is that you could think of the then professor of, the then chair of the department was Larry Loudon, who's a philosopher of science, of a kind of analytic type. And I think he had a different vision of the department as well, like what we should try to do is be competitive in relation to what's happening in the West. And he really went after Trask, right? But I think there was a split in the department itself between those people who are more like in the side of Asian philosophy and so on, who were more sympathetic, and my former advisor Roger Ames was quite sympathetic to Trask's position. And I think that actually is something that we need to think about is, the link between kind of the non-Western and the Hawaiian and how we make those kinds of connections. And I know that the department is hiring someone who's actually going to make more of those connections. But this is something to think about because I think there are a lot of similarities that we might be able to talk about between sort of the Asian and then the and the Hawaiian, even though it's complex, because one of Trask's arguments is that it's partly with the Japanese, it's precisely the Japanese who come, so the Asians who in some sense are part of the colonization project, right? So that I think is the complicated issue. Now, another figure for me who was very, very interesting for me to understand this issue is, and who maybe problematizes the idea in some sense of the opposition that I just mentioned between the Asian and the philosopher of science is Peter Manicus, who was also someone I worked fairly closely with. And he was a philosopher of science, a Marxist philosopher of science, but an avid supporter of the movement, definitely a supporter of Trask. And he was very influenced by this kind of realist theory of science that Roy Bosker sort of promotes as a kind of Marxist perspective. So this is something that I'm going to come back to at the end, because I think there's a certain question about how to think epistemology and sort of Hawaiian sovereignty, Hawaiian epistemology, and so on. So now I want to get into Trask's work itself, and note the double romanticism. So the first is an imperialist romanticism, right? And that is the way in which Hawaii is being objectified. And the other side is a resistance, and that is, I think, what relates to more my talk that I just gave. So there's romanticism on both sides, and the key is to distinguish. And there are probably also two epistemologies that are involved here. And so that I'm going to come to at the very end. So what I'm going to say is we can talk about a Hawaiian epistemology which is uncovered as part of resistance, but then there is an epistemology that is necessary to grasp Hawaiian oppression, right, or the commodification of Hawaii. So we can talk about that more in the discussion. So one is the alternative Hawaiian epistemology, and the other is a kind of an epistemology that identifies or grasps capitalism and imperialism. Now, these are not the same, is my contention. So first, let's look at the imperialist romanticism that we see in Hawaii. And so this is where there is a fictional Hawaii. I don't think I want to read this because I don't want to spend too much time. But this is where Hawaii is sort of commodified, right? The tourists come in, right? It becomes all of that, and there's almost this kind of, that we see in Hollywood movies. Think of Hapahala, Blue Hawaii, all of that stuff, right? But on the other hand, she talks about commodification the commodification of Hawaii, right? The commodification, exploitation of people who are, sort of they're witnessing this, right? And this is where you see again almost the primitive sexuality, which is connected to a kind of presence subsuming the past. And so here, notice talks about steel sort of shopping malls and so on, layered parking lots, etc. And I think the point here is the covering over of the past that we've talked about, right? What was once ingeniously irrigated taro lands feeding millions of Hawaiians over thousands of years, right, are now, these multi-storied hotels and so on. But and here, of course, Goa comes in as well. So this is where she herself makes the South Asian connection, and that would be the way. The other connections we could make are a lot of the local identities that we see in South Asia. I think Tamil would be one of them. But I think I want to stress here a term that Trask uses quite a bit, and that is prostitution, right? That where she says the state of Hawaii becomes the pimp, and then and it prostitutes Hawaii, right? And so she talks about commodification and prostitution of Hawaiian native cultures, and notice that it's a universal phenomenon. Now here, of course, when we think about prostitution and commodification, some of us will immediately think of Marx, right? Where Marx in the economic and philosophical manuscript says prostitution is only a specific expression of the general prostitution of the laborer. And since it is a relationship which falls not to the prostitute alone, but also to the one who prostitutes, and the latter's abomination is still greater, the capitalist also comes under this head. So what this means, and this is the, I guess, the Marxist answer to Kaipu's earlier, the last question, is that we are not going to have the commons unless we have much more of a general transformation of capital, because capital itself implies a certain kind of universal prostitution. But now this is the second moment of Romanticism, right? Which is where we talk about pre-prostitution, the past as commons and as resistance, right? So when people of the land work and so on together harmoniously, the balance that results is called pono. This might sound a little bit like the romantic gestures that I was talking about earlier. So in Hawaiian society, the ali'i, or the chiefs, we heard more about them in more detail, right? Were required to maintain order, abundance of food, and good government. The maka ainana, or common people, worked the land and fed the chiefs. The ali'i organized production and appeased the gods. So this again was there before, and then after the commodification, what you need then is a revitalization, right? Revitalization, though, is possible precisely because of formal subsumption, which I'm not going to talk about now because I mentioned it in the earlier talk. So the break with the past cannot be total. Right, that's going to be the point. So capital, the key here is that, and I think this was there in the very first talk of our panel of our symposium. I think it was Amy, but who says that capital covers but does not erase, because if it erases, there's no revitalization possible. So then the question is, are we talking about a Hawaiian socialism? And I think that was it is there in implicit in Trask's ideas, right? Hawaiians continue to have allegedly illegitimate children, to hanai, or to adopt both children and adults outside of sanctioned Western legal concepts, to hold and use land and water in a collective form rather than a private property form, and to prescribe the notion and the value that one person should strive to surpass and therefore outshine others. So what's interesting here is the different, a kind of inherent socialism of Hawaiian culture, which he is sort of alluding to here, right? And again, we can, and then notice again the family here. The family here is the family and state. That distinction doesn't seem as clear as it would be in a modern capitalist society. So again, here sharing is the central value, right? Since it prevents individual decline. So again, sharing versus this idea of, this larger families might be relevant to numerous pre-modern societies, especially in Asia. In the Tamil context, of course, I mentioned the Tirukural. We could go into that. But I want to mention something else before I conclude, and that is Lilikala's. One of the things she says as well is that capitalist ideology is foreign to the Hawaiians because they do not want to create surplus value or to become a poe vai or a hana vai. So what's interesting here is the vai, right, which wealth, and the thing is here that wealth here is abstract wealth. If you're becoming just a poe vai, right, that is not wealth as it's usually thought of. Because if you want to just accrue wealth, so vai versus kala maybe, right? And here I don't know Hawaiian, so I'm just making this up as I go along. But it could be maybe the distinction between wealth and value, right? Because you have something like oihana kala oka moku aina o Hawaii, right? Which is the Department of Finance. So here they don't use vai, but they use kala. But of course money is not quite value, right? So this is where that distinction did not exist probably earlier in Hawaiian, but then it had to be imposed. So that what they're trying to do is make you think capitalist, and then once you do that, then you can think sovereignty, right? And I think that there are parts of text that go against that. So now conclusions. Hawaiian culture resists the logic of the treadmill, right? Getting more and more, right? Relative surplus value to produce more and more in less time, right? Becoming a poe vai, right? But consequently, it could be a step towards the commons. However, the question concerns how to create an identity politics that gestures towards something beyond itself, right? The universal, beyond capitalism, right? The resources are conceptual, are there conceptually, but what type of movement would be required to put this into practice? Now I'm going to end with some epistemological and ontological issues. So Hawaiian epistemologies are holistic, right? They don't separate between wealth and value and so on, right? It's vai. Value is both wealth and value, which means that they don't have a concept of abstract wealth. However, the problem is to grasp capital, one must make distinctions that are foreign to the Hawaiian epistemology, if one accepts my first premise, right? Such as the distinction between value and wealth. So without such a distinction, then capital and commodification are unintelligible, and clearly articulating the political goals of radical Hawaiian identity requires making capitalism identifiable as imperialism, because otherwise you can maybe talk about imperialism, but you're not going to be able to mention capitalism. So only then can identity movements point beyond themselves to something universal, beyond capitalism, I should add. And I think I'm just going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Mahalo, Viren, for the courage in kind of putting this all together in such short time. I just invited you 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's why I didn't want to do anything too.
Yeah, but that's wonderful. And I opened not to the public, but between the interlocutors themselves, like I would encourage you to ask each other questions, on the various points that are parallel or significant for 15 minutes, and then we open it to the public.
Okay, then maybe I'll start with a question to Mekhola. So one of the things I found interesting was when you mentioned this problem of you mentioned the Grundrisse and this problem of property as a social relation. So what immediately struck my mind is, are you then saying, I mean, isn't property always a social relation? So is it the case that what you're saying is that the social relation changes, and that the social relation that you're uncovering in the medieval period is different from the social relation? Is that the point? If you
I mean,
could
I think
give
I was
your-
coming from two places. One is that often when one reads sort of, works on sort of medieval property, people often tend to take the sort of liberal definition of property for granted, in the sense that people often take the individual as the proprietor. But it's never actually clarified that that's the sort of understanding of relationships of property that a particular scholar is working with. So that's one. And the other is this idea, of property as having a double form, which is that men are proprietors, ontologically, meaning that they are part of a community, right? So as a Brahmin, you're a proprietor. As a Vakataka, you're a proprietor, and so on and so forth, right? And then being a proprietor ontologically as part of a community, then you objectively relate to something outside of yourself, your female kin, land, produce, and so on and so forth. So that's the distinction, I think, that's what I was that's the kind of working definition of property that I'm thinking through. That the individual never exists outside of the community, even as a proprietor.
Okay, thanks.
I actually had a question. Go ahead, Kaipu.
No, I was just gonna follow up with a question on that. So it seems to me that the kind of like the objects to which subject has right to is included in their particular subjective identification in that sort of
Correct.
formulation. And so like what then is the obviously the problem of caste is massive, but to what extent does the if it is in that social relation that conditions the relation to property, and it's kind of implied in whatever caste you belong to as Brahmin or whatever, to what extent can this be overcome, I guess, with a renewal of social relations? So like to what extent is organizing a successful kind of tactic to change social relations, in that sort of way? Like what kind of, I'm sure I'm missing a lot of context, but what are the real barriers, I guess, to overcoming this? Is it just that the social relations are so thoroughly intact that there is now state power that enforces it? Or is it possible to organize, in such a way that that is generative of a sort of commons in relationship, as opposed to, it being asserted top down, because it seems like that's not going to happen. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I think it returns to this question of the politics. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry about that. No, I think it returns to this question of the politics of time, right? Like when we are trying to recover, what is it that we are trying to recover? So as you may and also the other thing is that while we are sort of using things like, the caste and things like that, the truth of the matter is we still know so little about what caste is in this period, right? We often sort of know of caste from a much later period, and it would be anachronistic to back project from the context that Ananya was kind of talking about in her brilliant presentation yesterday, to kind of think that that is exactly what it was in the past, right? So as we kind of think about moving towards social justice, what are we trying to return to, if one believes in a politics of romantic anti-capitalism, I think is the question, I think. I actually had a question for the both of you, Kawēlau, Kaipu. Thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation and I learned a lot. And I was actually curious about this question of the role of genealogy. And I think, Kaipu, you mentioned this a little bit. The question of, that in the case of the ali'i, the chiefs, right? What role did genealogy play here, right? And I was just curious about that, and the reason I'm asking this is that in the case of sort of aristocrats in the South Asian context, when they are allocating resources, when they're redistributing resources, even when the redistribution is happening amongst elites, so not the kind of redistribution that you were talking about, They are also articulating their own aristocratic genealogy in the same documents, right, at the same time. So I was just curious to learn more.
Yeah. So genealogy is kind of like, I imagine it might be kind of similarly a sort of pedigree. It's like justifies your right to rule and all this kind of stuff. It also is, and that justification of a right to rule is like by virtue of tracing your genealogy back to the beginning of time, essentially. Um, now, and so there are real competitions, like the seventh monarch of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Kalakaua. There was a fierce election where they were both vying basically on the basis of genealogy of whether or not, like, what gives them the right to rule. And that was like a massive kind of component of the race. And so that was the way in which they kind of justified themselves. That's the way they exerted their rule. Um, uh, Diplomacy between the chiefs was a matter of genealogy and all this kind of stuff. And so there's a reality to genealogy and that it exerts itself in the social relations, but it's complicated by this matter of kind of what Viren was pointing out about the whole Hanai thing, like the in the possibility of a non-traditional, non-nuclear family, where like the borders of private property that were enshrined in the Mahele, they're porous, the borders of the genealogy. People can be included, excluded, at a matter of somewhat convenience. And so it becomes basically everything and nothing at the same time. And this is further exemplified by the fact that on the island of Oahu, some 400 or so years before Kamehameha unified the archipelago, this guy, Maili Kukahi, who is the chief of Oahu, he does this massive redistribution of wealth and inventory of the lands and da 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 da. He sets everything into order, and then he institutes these what are called muaha ikupuna, like they're called Halenawa, which are also muaha ikupuna. These are places where you list your ancestors, and in order to enter into the thing, you have to demonstrate that you know your ancestry. And this was something that only chiefs could do. But on Oahu, because the Halinawa were not forbidden to commoners, they had a right to list their ancestry. And with the establishment of the Halinawa, they then become it levels the playing field. And so the Hawaii Island chiefs, and this is maybe part of the reason why they had probably the most exaggerated kapu. They grabbed the most exaggerated taboos from the Kauai chiefs because they had the weakest genealogy. And so they exacerbated the stratification of society because on Oahu, there effectively were no chiefs after Maili Kukahi. Maili Kukahi says, I'm going to do away with the chiefdom, and now everything is going to be held in common. And what that does is there's some period of peace, but as soon as the Kauai chiefs and the Big Island chiefs hear that there are no chiefs on Oahu, they immediately start going to war over it, So, but so genealogy is kind of like this everything and nothing. And it's everybody who does know their genealogy and can trace it back to the beginning of time has a right to participate, to make decisions in Kala Aina and distribution of the commons. But yeah.
Is there time for one more question, or should we just open it up?
No, we have time.
Okay. So I have a question also for both Kaipu and Kawēlau. And that is that when you were in the sort of larger scheme, you have love of country or patriotism from 1890s to 1930s, and then love of land from 1976 to the present. So I have two questions. So one is, could you talk a little bit? I mean, I know this was the whole presentation, but if you could sort of rethink or explain a little bit the significance of that, the distinction between those two. Does love of land from 1976 still imply some notion of country as well, or is it gone? And then the in-between period, could you say something about that? Thanks.
Yeah. Kawēlau, you want to do that and then I'll follow up?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we use the terms interchangeably. I
Yeah.
feel like depending on what the context is, right? So, when Mauna Kea was going on, we spoke about ourselves as Aloha Aina, which doesn't just mean lover of land, right? But at that point, we're talking about something that's bigger than that, right? We're talking about standing up to the powers that be in a nationalistic fashion. And so I think that in some ways, I don't see personally, I don't see the sort of the level of separation between those two. I think that many of us use those two terms interchangeably, I mean, I feel like, yeah, a lot of the community does exactly that, depending on the situation.
Yep. Yeah, definitely whenever people say Aloha Aina, it signifies both love of country and the kind. But the person who really problematized it is Noinoi Silva, who in her Aloha Betrayed kind of goes in on the translation of Aloha Aina as patriotism because she wants to make this feminist point that it's not about uh, the patriarchal structures that uphold country, da 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 da, but it is instead this exalting of the land, da 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 da. Now, the problem with that, however, is that um, it dismisses the way that they're characterizing themselves. Okay, these are people in the kingdom period. They have treaties with everyone around the world. Okay, the leaders of these organizations speak three or four different languages. Okay, they have this classical Western education, and they choose to translate themselves as the Hawaiian Patriotic League. Of men and women and whatever their groups are, and so. Um, she says instead that it's love of the land. But if you look at the Hawaiian Kingdom primary resources, the people who are interpreting Aloha Aina as love of the land were the people who were pro overthrow. They were the annexationists. They're saying, no, don't think of the country. Think of your land. This is the real Aloha Aina. Like you'll be able to still stay on your land because it's not developed yet, blah, 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 blah. Aloha Aina is having your hands in the soil, whatever. And so this greenwashing of Aloha Aina had already happened in the kingdom era, where it was being done in order to further the interests of the overthrow and to facilitate the extraction of value out of Hawaii by the sugarcane industry. Never mind the fact that they're taking all the water and stuff, so it's harder to put your hands in the soil. Okay, but there's all that kind of stuff. So um, that's kind of the point where I feel like it's necessary to make an intervention and say that there is a sort of distinction. But it's true now that the Hawaiian Nationalist Project is the Hawaiian Sovereignty Project, is the Hawaiian Land Back Project, is the Hawaiian, ecological, cultural, whatever project. There is no distinction to be made because fights need to be moved on all fronts, like Kawēlau was saying. So,
I also think that it's important to sort of remember and not forget, right? That we continue to have to push back against powerful organizations continuing to trying to co-opt the term Alohaina. So,
mhm.
including the university. So,
Yeah.
yeah, just wanted to make sure to put that in there as well.
Thank you, all of you. Now, we invite questions from the panelists, the attendees.
Nandini, I don't know if you can see me because I'm logged in sort of differently.
No, we can see you.
Oh, okay, because I had my hand up if nobody else has their hand up.
Yeah, please go on, Vinita.
Oh, okay. Aloha. Thank you for the great discussion on land and other matters and in other areas. I have a couple of things to ask, and I'm so pleased to see Kawēlau on the committee, I mean, on the panel. Um, um, we just anecdotally, I will just share that we had a conversation at a reception after the PO Summit, and I've been meaning to follow up forever, but didn't get around to it. But clearly at this point, I realize I have to take your class if I really want to learn more. But what I wanted to ask Kawēlau and Kaipu, if you would both kind of weigh in on this matter. There are two things I'm concerned about. And one of them is, what is the sort of significance of the Mahele in our contemporary environment? And the reason I ask this question is the anecdotal thing that I shared with Kawēlau at that reception was, I think I own a small plot of land and my little tiny house in Kapahulu. And at one point, I had to do some transfer of like ownership, right? And at that point, my attorney made a sort of side remark about, good for you, you got this piece of paper, but do you know about the Mahele? And that made me think like, okay, I really need to understand what this means. And so I think your presentation today just really raises more questions than answers for me. But I think what I'm looking for is not some stability about where I stand on this thing, but also maybe some more troubling things that I should be thinking about. And the other big question I have is the trust for public lands. What role do they have on land matters in Hawaii? I know they have a presence here and they work with the federal government, the US federal government, and I'm kind of concerned about that. I know you didn't mention it. I'm sorry that I bringing up introducing something that you didn't talk about, but I kind of want to understand the relationship of that organization and whether they have any connections to Hawaiian sovereignty movements and groups related to land recovery.
So good to see you, Monica. Aloha. So yeah, we had this conversation, and it's always a difficult one to have, because people that buy property here believe that, when they get the title search back, they're like, okay, got clear title, I'm good. However, being that all land titles originate at the Mahele, and vast majority of all of the deeds had that koinae phrase on it, it is very difficult to sort of think about the possible ramifications of that, right? Does that mean that if there's a does it mean that if there's a trail on your property where people go to gather something, are you obligated to give them access, right? And who are the people that you give access? It's very difficult. So I think that the biggest for me when I think about the current day ramifications of the Mahele, um, I think that ultimately, right, when we look at what and I'm using finger quotes here, but like what rights we have as beneficiaries, named beneficiaries in the in the Constitution, the Hawaii State Constitution, as Native Hawaiians, I feel like every single thing that was on there is because of kingdom law, and to a certain extent, mostly because of the Mahele. And so I feel like when we think about, because, okay, so we talked a little bit about the water, things like that, but there's also a huge amount of land, right, that's undeveloped, or most of it's undeveloped and is held in trust. Um, but we don't know what that looks like, right? What does that mean exactly? But I think what's most important for me as somebody who teaches Hawaiian history is to help students and everybody else to understand how this happens, how this begins, because it really is the Mahele, which is not a Haole construct. It has been called that for a very long time. But when you actually look at this system, there's no way that you can call it a Western construct, just because what Western construct do you know that gives Indigenous people perpetual land rights, right, in perpetuity? That just doesn't happen. And so I just feel like it's really important in terms of when I teach to help everybody understand that this is the beginning, and no matter what property you're talking about, um, this is something that affects every single property here in Hawaii. I know Kaipu.
Yeah, I just follow up on the second question about the land trust and who manages it and stuff. Like the big issue now is the renewal of the military leases in Hawaii that are coming up at the end of this year, beginning of next year. Military has been leasing land for $1 a year since, basically the 60s or whatever. And so, but in order to negotiate new terms for new leases, which is what is the kind of hegemonic, that would be the reproduction of the conditions of production. The governor needs to consult the beneficiaries, but he only after months of already talking to the military organized the committee, and then he never did meet with them once. People comprised of people from the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, and then just like some sporadic people from quote unquote the Hawaiian community, most of the people already in the governor's pocket, who probably wouldn't, actually voice serious concerns, but haven't done them anyway. So to assume that public lands are even treated as public lands is already too much. And so the public lands effectively function as like the private land of the state. That really actually mean that they are available for seizure by the federal government at any particular moment. And so they're almost two layers removed from the public, even as they are called public. And so that's kind of the levels of alienation, I guess you could say, of the perversion of public lands. And so even though we have these codified constitutional rights as beneficiaries, it's not until something crazy happens that they're actually the question of treating them as public arises. So, yeah.
Thank you both.
And that being said, I feel like there's a very strong case to be made so that we are able to push that forward and ask those questions. I think that right now, when we look at Native Hawaiians as a demographic, I feel like we are becoming more and more educated. We're starting to understand and uncover our history that has been completely erased for good reason, right? Because America's and their roles have not been, not exactly exemplary behavior. And so we understand the reason for the erasure, but the point is, right, even though I appreciate the fact that we have those rights, because without those rights being in place, there's nothing to assert. And I feel like it's a placeholder. It's a placeholder so that in the future, and I think that we are definitely moving forward in that direction to be able to try to untangle what does it mean? What does it mean that we are this special type of beneficiary when we're talking about all of that land? I mean, so yeah.
There's a question from Oishi.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Aloha. I'm Ushi, and I'm a first-year doctoral student. I really enjoyed the panel discussion today, and I learned a heck lot. So my question is to Professor Gomes. Uh, so heads up, I don't deal in medieval India, so my question can be a bit stupid. But I was just wondering, Professor Gomes, that you were talking about sons and the relationship with father through land and how they are connected with the analogy of seed and field, where wife helps, like she is the representative of kshetra, and basically son or the husband is the seed. So and with context to that, it reminded me of a 16th century verse, like a Bangla version of Ramayana, which says that Sita was actually born in the field where her father, King Janaka, had gone to do some ritual, and while plowing the field, he had discovered Sita. That's where she gets her name from. She is, I think, also known as the queen or the goddess of Bhumi or land. So I was wondering, Professor Gomes, what is your take on that? Like, do you think that such kind of narratives kind of challenge Dharma Shastra's take on paternity, property, and women's role? Thank you.
Jesse, as actually the expert on these kinds of questions, would you like to help me address Oishi's
Yeah,
question?
sure. I was just typing that story is there in the Valmiki Ramayana. We don't need to go to Kritibash for that. What do I have to say? I mean, just that the patterns you described are so omnipresent and they're repeated so much. You know, this idea of the king is the father, the people are his children, the wife is often, I mean, the standard way in Sanskrit of talking about a child being born is to say that the man produced a child on or in the woman. The woman is in the locative case as an object, but only the man is in the nominative case. So, I mean, these things are repeated so much that you wonder if they're true. I think that's kind of my thought process. Like, I see the text and I think the text is history because the text is trying to make this true. And that's the info that we've got basically. And we know to sort of to think critically about it. But yeah, there's so much that we can't know that must have been outside of this framework. But I think this framework was maybe more fragile than it looks retrospectively, and that was the role of ideology was much greater. You know, like you don't have to believe American ideology to be completely controlled by it. Whereas in ancient India, they were trying to make you feel it, you know, in your heart that the king is your father. I don't think I've got anything left. Mekhola, you got to save me.
No, I mean, I think that the Ramayana is a very interesting example. I mean, since the story is in Valmiki, I mean, the Ramayana essentially is an aristocratic story, right? So if you're thinking about, patriarchy, then I think it would be helpful then to think about what kind of patriarchy is a story like Valmiki's. And of course, there are so many Ramayans, right? I mean, I don't need to tell you that, Oishi. So it's like if you're looking at the Valmiki Ramayana, then what kind of patriarchal structure is that text presenting to you, right? So I mean, what do you make of that story, right? That Sita is called Sita because her name literally means, an agricultural furrow in the land, and that her father finds her in the field. I mean, what do you make of that story, right? Because what is the Ramayana but a story for us to hear, right, and to kind of make sense of?
Well, both of these epics, especially around the question of gender, they I don't think problematize is the right word. They want to create some kind of chaos in which no term is stable. I mean, it's like they'll call everything dharma. Maybe this is similar to something Kaipa was saying earlier. I'm faintly thinking there's a connection. But now I completely forgot what I was saying. What was I saying? Someone help me.
I think maybe something about Kapu.
Oh yeah, no, about these epics, you know, that don't have the gender roles necessarily of the later Kavya tradition, and that create, you know, that are essentially about bad things happening to good women. I mean, they can be read as feminist texts in many ways, even though that sounds kind of insane.
But they have been, as we know, right?
Of course, yeah. And then finally, at the end of the Ramayana, Sita takes her revenge and says, "I'm not doing it anymore. I
And she
want to be
goes back into
reabsorbed."
the earth. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
She's
Or in
like,
the
"F you."
Mahabharata, yeah. And in the Mahabharata, it's always like, why the hell are we doing what we're doing? It's so evil. And then the way of dharma is subtle. It's confusing, you know. So that way, a lot of this stuff was up for grabs, at least in the early epics. That's somewhat up for grabs. I mean, of course, it's an aristocratic society with all these ceremonies and things, but I think the actual take on like gender, it's a moving target. I don't think it's like this fixed thing at that point. Yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions and then we'll wrap up. Shankar?
Hi. Yeah. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Yeah. So I wasn't here yesterday, so I apologize if some of what I have to say, might have been addressed yesterday. But I was thinking that the very rich conversation that we've been having about the commons, it's at least kind of like, I mean, there are two things going on. One is a history of the commons, which is based on a European and a particular kind of a tradition, the enclosure, the sort of the material resources and the enclosure of material resources. But I think alongside, I'm thinking here, for example, of Anusha's presentation this morning, there's also a kind of a sensory and affective kind of history which accompanies the more material history of the commons and the enclosure. And I think what I see going on, I don't have so much a question as much as an observation, which might be appropriate for the concluding session of the symposium, maybe, is that I think what's going on is an attempt to kind of think through, those aspects of the commons, both the affective, subjective dimensions of what an anti-commons politics of hierarchy looks like, and then what might be a kind of an anti-commons kind of contemporary politics look like, which cannot be just simply about the material. And I think, a few kind of ways in which I think about this. I mean, we've talked about caste quite a lot, which is appropriate, and we've talked about indigeneity as well. And I'm sort of kind of one of the places for me to go to is my very good friend and mentor on things Tamil, Nirmal Selvamani, and his work on Thinai. And he's had like this long standing as part of a group of really interdisciplinary group of people in Chennai and in South India in general, who are trying to think through a kind of a politics which is anti-caste, anti-hierarchy, anti-state, actually, based on sort of the the Sangam period came up, but this idea of Thinai societies as societies of the commons. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think there's a way to bring indigeneity and caste together, like or anti-caste politics and indigenous politics together, because I think somebody like Nirmal would make the argument in terms of indigeneity that there is a kind of an indigenous society which is pre-caste, and then this society is also anti-caste. So that would be one place. And the other place would be, really to think through Neo-Buddhism. And I think Ambedkar is just one point of entry into this. I think for those of us who are South Asianists, I think I would kind of like, the long history of Buddhism, a very complicated history, sometimes very top-down and hierarchical, but more often than not, sort of very bottom-up and anti-hierarchical, where it's been the place of kind of innovation for so many of these questions. And I think what is powerful about the Neo-Buddhist position is that bringing together of a kind of a material, critique of hierarchical arrangements, but in a way which is very attentive to the subjective and the emotional and the affective. And I think Ambedkar, even though he's just one, Ayodhi Das, for example, in the Tamil context, is a very important example here. And Ambedkar himself, towards the end of his life, I think it was a few years before his death, he actually kind of facilitated the republication of P. Narasu's Tamil Buddhism. So he was very much aware of Tamil Buddhism and Buddhism across South Asia. As many of us know, he traveled in the final years and kind of participated in Buddhist conferences in Nepal, in Burma, in Ceylon. And I'm bringing this up because I think Ambedkar, through his life, who's very kind of liberal, right? He's maybe a liberal or a left liberal thinker. In many ways, he's not radical at all, but he's kind of like trying to sort of find his way to some, kind of formulation which allows him to resolve all these things. I mean, he's an American pragmatist. He's the student of American pragmatist philosophers, and then he's also has this kind of engagement with Buddhism. And it's to me something instructive that some of his things he's struggling with, he actually is beginning to kind of answer through that move to Neo-Buddhism. And I think it's something for us to maybe think about in terms of an engagement with the politics of the commons in the contemporary. I realize it's not a question, but I did warn you that I had an observation, not a question.
No,
Sorry.
we welcome observations. Thank you. And Ananya, please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This is so rich, and I have so much to actually ask in some ways. I'm going to try to keep it brief. And it's as much to our Hawaii specialist colleagues and to our South Asian colleagues in some ways, which is really what, and it's a self-centered question because, of course, as a historian who deals with the colonial moment, the first thing that I confront is the distortion of the archive. And the way in which things get reported to us. So, for example, in the case of Goa, the first setting that happened, the first sort of compact that happens after Portuguese intrusion, the Floral actually gives us a version of what might sound like a foundation myth of settlement in the region. And that becomes the basis of the sort of legal and property relations that the state recognizes. So the story goes that every village was led by these gaungars, which the Portuguese glosses as these kind of governors or minister or benefactor, whose position derives from an unknowable kind of mythic time. And then these four men fructified and governed an unused land so that a large population came to settle it. And that's why they were recognized as gaungars. And so overlords would come to assert sovereignty over them and oblige gaungars to pay income and tribute in exchange for leaving their inheritances and customs untrammeled. And the Portuguese already, because they've expelled like Muslim landholders already from this territory, use this sort of myth as a way to kind of recognize the agrarian corporation within their own state and then also extract revenue from it, right? And so there's this other layer, of course, that's going on because the other sort of foundational myth that's really relevant to this whole region is the Parshuram myth of migrant Brahmins having to be brought after indigenous fishermen Brahmins turn out not to be good enough for Parshuram in terms of settlement. And you have various sort of versions of this myth. And so on the one hand, you have the sort of the very caste-inflected but older pre-colonial archive of the Parshuram myth cycles that exists up and down the Malabar coast all the way to Goa. And then on the other hand, you have this colonial Portuguese myth, right, which is foundational to colonialism. And so, at least in my case, well, where do you go? Is a rock and a hard place, right, in terms of trying to think through what colonialism does then and what return might even look like in at least the South Asian context. And so for my Hawaiian colleagues, I'm really interested in hearing like what you are kind of confronting and thinking through that question of both what Hawaiian hierarchies might have mean. So I was really struck by the fact that Oahu sort of has this moment of radical sort of clearly a really radical move to sort of disacknowledge chieftain, the basis of chiefdom enough that it creates conflict, right? So there's pre-colonial politics at play and hierarchies at play, and then simultaneously the colonial project. And so then to go back to Viren's question, what is the return and where do you find the return in the archive?
Yeah, mahalo for the question. I think what I think becomes increasingly more and more apparent as I kind of think about this more is the fact that, we cannot return to the commons. We can't return to anything, but the commons themselves are going to have to come back to us. But they're going to come back to us in a kind of as a sort of transmutation of our own effects, kind of like how the elite become the elite through this sort of association, uh this kind of distortion through the association with the pole, with the origins of creation. And so it's like to take the major Renaissance projects together, like the big ones are Kaho'olawe and the Polynesian Voyaging Society, Canoe Hokulea, who there's a theory that Hawaiians drifted here, and that we managed to land here as a matter of dumb luck. And then there's a project to say that's wrong. And they didn't go and cut down koa trees though. They built a fiberglass canoe. And then they found a Micronesian who could get us to Tahiti. And then the Micronesian teaches the Hawaiians how to do it. And then we put it in our own words. And then that becomes modern navigation practices, So it's not we didn't return to Hawaiian navigation, but now we have an opportunity to look at Hawaiian navigation to discover what that might have been. Now that there's more people who speak Hawaiian and da 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 da, we can do the research to figure it out. But it's not going to be that because we already have people who know how to navigate in the way that they were taught by this Micronesian guy. Okay, so that's the I think that's a good metaphor for thinking through this restructuring of the myth of the past. So like there was the Hawaiian stories say we all come from Kahiki, we're not from here. And then the Haole say, yeah, you come from Kahiki, but you got here as a matter of dumb luck. And then we say, oh no, but it was intentional, and we prove it. And so there are these two versions of the competing history of the past. And then when there's evidence or whatever to the claim of Hawaiian agency, then we can think about what that means for our future moving forward. And there's a very similar structure with the whole Kaho'olawe thing. It's Kaho'olawe means like the subtraction. And so it's kind of like this repressed element because it is one of the names of the god is Kanaloa. One of the names of the island is Kanaloa, who's one of the major gods of the Hawaiian religion. And so, but the recovery of the name of Kanaloa only happens as an effect of the fact that it was bombed, and not necessarily that it was bombed, but that people wanted to make a claim about Aboriginal lands and reparations and stuff like that. And so there's this need to act. And so I think one of the things that I really want to demystify in Hawaiian politics is this whole like incessant obsession with knowledge. We have this desire to know, but the only time we made significant progress as a people is when people felt impelled to do something in the absence of knowledge. And they landed on that island and they did stuff. They used their bodies as human shields against the bombing from the military because they had a sense that there was something in that island worth dying for. And that's what gives us virtually every Hawaiian value that we have today. And so it's this need to just do and kind of follow your gut or whatever that obviously has its limits and needs to be analyzed in a way that it requires a certain kind of logos to organize it at some point. And I think what my dissertation is trying to do is articulate this as a sort of return to kapu, but a kapu that returns via aloha aina, which has nothing to do with chiefs. And so there's this kind of there's that kind of structure at play. But in terms of the archives themselves, Kawēlau is a much better archival researcher than I. So I'll let her tackle that question.
So I feel like when we're talking about archives, I think you did a really great job of describing the problems with relying on archives as your sort of source of piecing history together. And I feel very fortunate. So made the decision. I started looking into the period right leading up to the overthrow, and then right after the overthrow up until like in the 1930s, 1940s, and realized very quickly that what little had been written about that time was written by old white guys. And they got it all wrong because they didn't speak Hawaiian. There was no, right? You were seeing one particular lens, and which didn't include anything Hawaiian. And so I decided to use the archive as my only source. So I use the archive as the only source. I've been doing this archival research for 10 years and piecing together what happened after the overthrow. Now, I'm very fortunate in that I've been able to go all over the world and do this research. And because Hawaii had so many international relationships with other countries, virtually every one of those countries, we have stuff in their archives. But also, even in Hawaii, the archive didn't start with the overthrow, which is unusual. Our Hawaii archives actually have both kingdom and post-coup stuff. And so yeah, I feel like archives are a tricky thing. You got to make sure that you get a balanced picture. I'm very fortunate in that we also have like more than 1 million pages of Hawaiian language newspapers that hadn't even been many of them are not even searchable yet. And so it's this crazy large archive of amazing stuff that I'm sure is going to be just change what we think we know right now, right? So I don't really have an answer for that, except that you just got to keep pushing forward and really trying to interrogate, right, whose archive it is and so forth. I found some of the most interesting, eye-opening political understandings from archives like in Britain, right? Where Britain's leadership and Japan's leadership are talking to each other after the coup, after the illegal overthrow, and talking about things, right? So I feel like if you can find other ways to sort of look at the same thing, yeah, that's really been the best way that I found to ensure a balanced sort of take. Yeah.
With that amazing conversation, I would like to conclude this session, which has gone way past time. But I just want to add a personal note that in your slides, you mentioned the Hawaiian notion of commons as something that belongs to no one. And that makes me feel really happy because I think I had started with this illusory and misunderstood or deliberately misunderstood kind of framework of India negative and Hawaii positive, and that there is a kind of negation that runs through both, that the nowhere and the void is what is most inspiring. So I just want to thank the Kamakakūokalani Center for Hawaiian Studies, Kaipulaumakaniolono, Keala, and Kawēlau, and Kamana Beamer for being such generous collaborators and for giving so generously of your time. And especially all my South Asian colleagues who came despite knowing that there was a storm raging and that this symposium might not run. And I really am so grateful to you all for having come physically and be and engaged in such a robust participation and made this conversation so rich. So I would like to actually mention your names: Ananya, Mekhola, Sharvari, Viren, Anusha, and also Amy and Kalzang. Thank you so much. And also the EC, the South Asian Studies EC, and Mari, who's not here, who's run around and done so much work. So with that, I hope we have future collaborations and this conversation doesn't end, and that we've all learned something, like what Kawēlau was saying, something at an oblique kind of direction, something not central, but on the side. Thank you so much.